and foremost, I would like to welcome you to the session and to thank you as well for joining us. We have 62 active participants now. That's a good number. So thank you very much for choosing this session today. And also, I would like to thank DataFest Tbilisi for inviting us to this session, more particularly Lali, who has been patient with us in terms of framing this session. So what do we want to achieve in this session? First, we want you to assess how you have been doing data projects in the past. And then also at the same time, we would like you to understand our primary advocacy, which is data empowerment, and hopefully convince you that it is essential and important in your line of work, so that at the end of the day, at the end of the session, it will help you rethink your strategies and approaches in working with data in the future. Now, so just to say very quickly that Andy and I, and Reyes and I are actually running a data empowerment blog at Medium. Everything that we'll be sharing to you today is actually expounded neatly and more how do you call it, more elaborately in our data empowerment blog. So just look that up and see what we've been writing so far. Okay, so before I start, I would like to invite you to take a quiz. So if you're using a computer on your browser, type menti.com. And if you're using a cell phone, you can also do that. On the browser of your cell phones, type menti.com. And if it is asked for you a code, kindly type 740631. So if you're using a computer, just type on the browser menti.com. Or in your cell phones, type menti.com in the browser. And if it's asking for you for a code, please use 740631.
It should look like this, yes?
Yeah, it should look like that. Thanks very much, Mihai. So now I will engage you in a preliminary survey. And let me just shift browsers this time. I would like to engage with you on a preliminary survey. I can already see 3 people here, 4 people, 5 people running. That's good. That's good to see. So let's wait for a little bit. Let's take a look. Probably let's get around to hopefully half of the people here, around 25 or 30. Let's see. So again, for those of you who just came in, go to your browsers, type menti.com and use the code 740631. Okay, we're now 14. Let's wait for a little bit for the others to come. Hopefully they're coming soon. Okay, let's give around 2 minutes for the others to be able to log onto the portal, to Menti. Seems like we only have 15 for now. We're stuck to 15. Okay, we're 17 out of 57. We're short of 40 participants at the very least, but let's see. Maybe the others will be coming in a little bit. So Sonia was saying she's already in. Okay, we're now good to 18. Nice, that's nice. Okay, so let's take a look at the first set of questions that I'd like you to answer. Okay, there you go. Oh, so which of the descriptions suit you best? 10 have already responded, and we have like 11 have already responded. Okay, so we have 4 people saying they design data projects. We don't have anyone here in the group that implement. Oh, we have 1. So 1 person implementing data projects. Now it gets to be 7 for designing data projects. 3 are evaluating or assessing or reviewing data projects. That's good. That's nice. Then we have 2 who are designing or doing a lot of things actually. Designing, implementing, and evaluating data projects. And then finally, we have like 7 or 8 that are not at all involved in data projects currently.
They are just fans of data, but they look analyze from a fan's point of view.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah. That could also be one, right? So currently we have 27 in our poll, and we have a majority of participants in this session actually either designing data projects or evaluating data projects, with a few implementing data projects, and at least 2 people actually designing, implementing, and evaluating data projects all at the same time. That's good. So let's take a look at this. I would like you to, I'd like us to talk about your opinion on a few things regarding data. And I have 5 statements here that I'd like you to evaluate and see whether you strongly disagree or strongly agree to these statements. The first one is data projects should be designed with the people that we envision will be benefiting from it. The second one is about clear policies in protecting and safeguarding data needs to be in place, or clear policies in protecting and safeguarding data needs, or safeguarding data, sorry, needs to be in place. The third statement is data policies must be simple and can be understood by any potential user, even without degrees in law or computer science. Then we have the fourth, that when we say those people whose data are collected must be made to understand how their data is processed and used. And finally, the last statement is organizations must publish data from their projects, subject to privacy safeguards. So we have 5 who have already responded, and let's take a look at what's the overall view of people that are joining this session for today. Okay, we have like 18 people have already responded. Let's take a look at the details of the statements. For the first statement, data projects should be designed with the people that we envision will be benefiting from it. A large majority are saying they agree. We have a few that are saying not very sure. And 1 or 2 people actually saying that they disagree with that notion. In the second statement, regarding clear policies in protecting and safeguarding data needs to be in place, we have an overwhelming majority, around 17 of the respondents out of the 20 are actually saying that should be the case. We have 2 in the middle. Policy is simple and can be understood by any potential user, even with degrees in law or computer science. So we have 8, half saying strongly agree. We have 6 in the middle. 2 are saying they strongly disagree. Then we have the fourth statement. Those people whose data are collected must be made to understand how their data is processed and used. Again, almost half of our participants are saying yes. 5 are saying they don't agree with the statement, while like 4 are actually a little bit in the middle. Finally, in the last statement, organizations must publish data from their projects subject to privacy safeguards. 15, or roughly 75% of our respondents or the people attending these sessions are actually saying such should be the case, while 4 others here are actually saying we strongly disagree with this notion. Okay, thanks very much everyone for your participation in that quiz or in that Mentimeter exercise. At this point, I would like to shift to shift and go back to my screen, my slides, and talk about the topic that is the very essence of our discussion today, and which has a very strong relation on what we actually were saying in our quiz as to how we actually treat people that are part of our projects and their data. What's our view on data privacy in terms of how we treat data privacy in our projects and so on. Okay, so I would just like to ask very quickly, how do you feel about the quiz? You can type your responses on the chat box and tell us what exactly is it that you think about it. So a lot of us agree that data projects should be designed with people that we envision, that there should be clear policies and protecting and safeguarding data. Data policies must be simple and understood. Then we have less agreement on two aspects here, which is those people whose data are collected must be made to understand how their data is processed and used, and organizations must publish data from their projects subject to privacy safeguards. Okay, I'll go back to my point. And I think we can use those types of questions as a jump off point or as jump off points in the discussion of our topic today, which is about data empowerment. So why do we need to talk about data empowerment? So I think in the session this morning, somebody's talking was about the volumes of data that we are actually collecting on a daily basis. Some recent estimates say that there are about 59 to 100 zettabytes of data that's actually collected across the world now. And there are also estimates saying that 1.7 megabytes of data will be created every second for every person on the planet this year. That's quite a lot amount of data. But in a lot of cases, users or citizens like us or people like us are actually data producers. We are just data producers. We are generating and sharing data, including even our personal information. On the other hand, however, governments, businesses, private sector actors who are collecting data from us are actually exploiting our data to their benefit. People like us are typically shut out in the process, and in a way creating a system of data inequality. In a lot of cases, we call this data extraction paradigm, wherein people are just being extracted out with data, with nothing to do with the inability to do anything about it or even control whatever it is that they're able to share publicly. So it actually resulted to many data initiatives that entrench, for example, unfair structures. Why are we saying that? Because primarily, in the case of a data economy, those with capacity and capability are the ones who are able to harness data for their benefit. And sad to say, this has become a dominant paradigm in a lot of discourses on data, even in arenas such as data for good, data innovation, data for development, data for science. People are just spectators. They are being extracted with their data. Experts analyze it. Other people or decision makers take action. You have this top-down control and command approach in terms of data management or in terms of data, in terms of implementation of data for development projects. So this unfair system of data ownership, production, and use, at least for us, calls for action. So there used to be a paradigm of what we refer to as data rights. So some advocates actually are saying that there should be a right to data, and people should have the right to the data about them, the right to control the data about them, and also they should have access to data that shape their lives. For example, people should be given the right to access data of government, the data of government, because data of government is actually shaping the way they live their lives. But we know, for example, that based on recent reviews, only 40% of countries have right to information. Much less would be those that have rights to data. So, there are rights to information, but majority of us do not actually have access to data provisions. So we can be given processed data, but we don't have the granular level of data that we need, for example, for purposes of analysis and also for purposes of use. So we're saying that data rights are not enough, and we need to have active involvement of people. People have to have a say on how their data is used. They should be able to exercise privacy and protection. And at the same time, they should be able to demand transparency and accountability, especially from public organizations that are benefiting out of the data that they're sharing. Okay, so this is how we think data empowerment should be framed in terms of how we actually design, implement projects or implement data projects. So I'll go through at least two examples of projects that are using data. And I will ask you later on, what are your thoughts about this insofar as the data empowerment paradigm is concerned? So the first one is about the work by Flo Minder and the UN OCHA during the 2015 earthquake in Nepal. So as what will usually happen in an earthquake, there will be commotion, people will be moving and going to places that are safer for them. And so what Flo Minder and UN OCHA did was to actually use mobile phone data to be able to locate people and how they're moving from one location to the other. This made the process of distributing aid, for example, uh, or implementing relief programs to areas more efficient because they're actually able to locate using mobile phone data where the people are and how movement is actually being tracked from one place to the other. Giving, for example, relief agencies the opportunity to geolocate where the people are and how relief operations can be better guided. So that's one. The other one that I'd like to talk about is also another project which is done by a university, a private organization, and the city government of Jakarta in Indonesia, which they call Peta Jakarta. Here, as you can see, there's frequent flooding that's happening in Jakarta. People can actually report the status of the area in terms of the severity of the flooding. And that's actually done through Twitter and using a hashtag, which is Banjir or flood. And then that data that is actually accumulated through the hashtags are actually mapped out to be able to see what is the severity of flooding in areas and how response can be attributed, or so how response can be done more efficiently by responding to those areas where the severity of the flooding is actually occurring. Okay, with these two examples, which of the two cases do you think portrays elements of data empowerment, and why do you think so? So I would just like to say very quickly that those questions that you're actually raising in the chat box actually are the same kinds of questions that we're actually dealing with when we're talking about data empowerment. But first, let me start off with just a bit of definition. So in our view, what do we mean by data empowerment? For us, it's the process where people on their own or with the help of intermediaries take control or gain power to take control of their data to promote their and their society's well-being. So I will explain it a little bit in a while, but for us, empowerment is a process wherein the people with their own initiative or with the help of others can actually gain control or take power or gain the power to take control of their own data to promote their society's well-being. At the end of the day, we're looking at the goal or the end view that the use of data will promote their own as well as their society's well-being. And by this, we mean to say that data empowerment is actually relational in a process, because in the process of empowering others, some will gain power while others will stand to lose power. So for example, if you talk about governments actually publishing data on procurement and making it publicly accessible by civil society organizations and social accountability advocates, they're actually bringing out the power from holding such data to other people so that people will be able to demand an exact accountability out of government, which in a way is actually scary if that is the case, because there's a shift in power that will be happening from those that has the data to the ones that are actually given access to it. The second point that I'd like to raise is that data empowerment is a process. It's dynamic, it's iterative, it's non-linear, and also it's not an end state, meaning to say there's always a contestation that happens along the way. For example, in the case of the Peta Jakarta example, by the mere fact of actually publishing the data, that harnesses citizen-generated data for geolocating the severity of the flooding incident. It actually puts on the onus or the responsibility on the part of government to actually respond to where the severity of the flooding is. And at the same time, it also puts responsibility on the part of government to actually show, for example, that there has been something which is done in the process of empowerment is actually contextual because it facilitates or hinder empowerment processes. By this, we mean, for example, when you talk about data empowerment, it actually happens in a context where usually power is unequally distributed. And in this case, you can see, for example, that in the case of our use of social media, for example, we can see that some people with uh, social media companies like Facebook, for example, has a certain level of power over its users, in the same way that those who have the capacity to scrape and to analyze data regarding Facebook usage, for example, actually has a certain power over the others who don't have the resources or the capability to do so. And finally, we see that in terms of data empowerment, we look at it as a process where it can happen at the individual level, meaning individuals are actually acting on the data that they're able to take control of or have access to. But it can also be a case wherein intermediaries are actually helping other people to gain control or to actually also take advantage of the data that is collected about them. So in this case, when we do implement data projects, what shifts in thinking do we think are necessary? First one, we said that from treating people as passive spectators, we should be able to treat people as co-creators in terms of defining the data that will be collected, the data that how data will be analyzed, and the data how data will be used. Also, in terms of process or in terms of power dynamics, we have to move from intentional disregard of power structures in the communities where we work with to conscious consideration of the power dynamics that's in there. So data, as we have mentioned, is power in itself. And often those who have the capacity, the assets, and the skills to harness the power of data are the ones that are actually ultimately benefiting out of the process. And finally, I think the third shift that is needed to be done is from looking at enabling mechanisms to actually empowering initiatives. For example, there was a discussion in the chat box window, for example, a while ago, saying that we don't necessarily understand how our products, how the products that we consume are actually being made. But at the end of the day, there are regulations that are actually protecting us from any harm in the process. But such is true in a lot of aspects. Such may be true in a lot of aspects. But as we all know, legislation may not just be only the enabling. Legislations are only enabling elements, but they don't necessarily, for example, empower people from understanding how how data is actually collected and how data is being analyzed and so on. So just a very quick example on this process. There's one work that we see as something which has significantly shifted the view of how data is being looked at and the relationship of people with their data. In the case of the work of Fundación Paraguaya's Poverty Stoplight, it works like a survey of some sort, like how our national statistical offices are actually conducting surveys, but they're actually being the surveys are actually being implemented with people ranking their own perceptions of poverty using proxy indicators as health, access to water, access to education, sanitation, and so on. And looking at themselves in the lens of the tool that Poverty Stoplight is actually implementing. In a way, for example, the people are actually defining their level of poverty But at the same time, Poverty Stoplight does not stop there. It actually helps people see what are the possibilities for them given their livelihood assets, and what is it that they can do to lift themselves out of poverty. So if you look at this initiative as compared to usual census data, census data is extractive. It actually just takes people's data on how much are their assets, so how much is their income, how they're living, what's their access to water. But it doesn't actually bring back to the results to them. In the case of this initiative, for example, the results of the survey, the results of the data that the people are actually generating on their own becomes the basis for imagining their future, and also becomes the basis of crafting a getting out of poverty plan for themselves and their families. And that actually shifts the discussion on what data empowerment as opposed to data extraction would look like. So how do we do data empowerment? In this case, I would like to invite Andy, who's been consulting with several different international organizations on the design of data for development projects, who will be sharing with us at least a few tips on this one.
Okay,
Welcome.
Thanks so much, Miko and Mihai, and hi everyone. So now you heard from Miko sort of what data empowerment is, why it's important, sort of what's the conceptual framework behind it. I'll say a few words about how to actually do data empowerment, which is tricky, but we do have a couple of principles, tools, suggestions, some inspiration for you if you want to apply data empowerment in your work. So I saw the survey earlier, and 8 of you, or at least 8 of you, said you don't involve yourself in data projects. I'm not sure if I believe you, because what we've seen is that people sometimes say they don't do data projects, but in fact they do surveys, they run interviews, they collect data in different ways. And that in itself is already a data project, if you will, because you manage data, you handle data, and you deal with data. So I hope that's also relevant for those 8 of you who said they don't do data projects. Now, next slide, please. So there's we have 5 sort of categories or 5 practical tips for you on how to do data empowerment. The first one is really about responsible data practices. So before you do anything else, sort of you need to be clear about your responsible data strategy. So this is just to make sure that even if you don't empower people, which is fine because you might not have the resources or the technical, capacities and skills, just make sure you don't harm them in any way. So there's a number of the next slide, please. There's a number of resources, especially from the responsible data community. Exactly so. And there's a number of sort of frameworks, tools, there's methods, there's a lot of practical advice here on this website and elsewhere on the web. Just to make sure, or to help you think of what could actually go wrong, and if so, who would be negatively impacted, and how you can actually minimize or even mitigate these risks. And there's a number of things from threat modeling exercises, negative results models. There's privacy impact assessments that you might have come across. There's ways sort of to help you do responsible survey design and data collection processes. There's also a number of things around sort of data anonymization techniques and sort of data sharing agreements and all of that. So again, just want to emphasize that if you do nothing else, please make sure you apply responsible data practice in your work, especially in those countries where there's no strong data production regulatory frameworks. All right, number 2 is apart from the technical aspects of data, please see if you can make sure to really understand and address power dynamics. Because often when we run data projects, we think of how we collect the data, how we store it, who has access to it, how we visualize and all of that. But sometimes we don't think about what's sort of underneath it. And as Miko pointed out earlier, for example, in the procurement space, when procurement data is shared, it's not just about the technical aspects. It really is about a shift in power dynamics. So You just need to be aware of the data production and use will impact people in different ways. And some of the people you work with will gain power, but some of the people you work with might lose power. And so you need to be sort of cognizant of the fact that there might also be some pushback from people, those who lose power, and you need to sort of figure that out or sort of integrate in your thinking in the project design. Yes, next slide, please. And there's a number of tools and frameworks and checklists, and one of them that we share with you here is from Sida, so the Swedish Development Agency. And so this is quite a useful tool, but there's also other tools like the Data Cube, and we can maybe share, or maybe Mika, you can share it on the chat, the Data Cube framework, and there's a few other things that you can use to easily sort of not easily, but to actually get a better sense of power dynamics at play. Now, what's important to mention is that even with the most sort of rigorous analysis and the most thorough upfront planning, you might not be able to prevent every sort of unintended consequence, any sort of power shift, or maybe even worsen inequalities. So just make sure that sort of to constantly monitor any sort of power dynamics at play, even during implementation, not just during the design phase of a data project. Okay, number 3, and this is really at the heart of data empowerment, as Mikko mentioned earlier, is treating people as active users and not as passive producers only. So this is really, I think, what we're trying to do in every work that Mikko and I do on the data innovation, data for development space, is always think about, so those we collect the data from, how can we involve them in the usage of the data. And Mikko showed this example of poverty stoplight earlier, which is a brilliant example. There's a few more, and I'll show you some in a second. Because what we see a lot is sort of these, often when we talk about a data project, it's often about a data dashboard. So people want to see data, they want to have it visualized, they want to be able to see how things move, how things change when certain sort of parameters change. And often, at least in our experience, having a dashboard for a small group of people doesn't really do much, because there's always an assumption behind it that once you have access to the data, you have a dashboard, it's visualized, that you will take better decisions. But instead of that, and which is often not the case, instead what we're trying to promote is making the data accessible as widely as possible, to make sure that also those who the data is collected from get access to it. And I'll say a few words about making data accessible in a second. So here's just one framework, one diagram, which we will not share the source with you. This is sort of an example of the mainstream thinking in data and the data space, where, as you can see in the upper left corner, let me just increase the size a little. In the upper left corner, it says data providers. And here you have children, parents, third parties, friends, family, etc. And this is really what sticks out in many of the data projects that we've seen, is that people are always in data providers category and not so often in data users category. So when you look at data users, it's international agencies, it's governments, it's corporates, etc., political parties, but it's not the citizens, individuals that are considered as data users. Okay, fourth, so just going beyond just focus on data use, but think about how can you involve people in the data production or data collection even, so in the first step, or often the first step of a data project. So we've seen some super interesting projects, which we think are also some of the most impactful projects, where people are actually involved in this very first step, where it's about data collection, data compilation, data production. One of the examples Mikko talked about earlier is Peta Jakarta, which is super interesting. There's a few more, and you might have come across IP the Bribe, which originates from India, which is in sort of an online corruption reporting platform. Harris Map, which is collection of data on sexual harassment in Egypt. And these are some of the sort of well-known examples, but there's more of that. And sometimes they are referred to as citizen-generated data because the source of the data is really citizens. And it's, it's just stressing that point is really important behind sort of that, because behind every investment that you make in sort of a data initiative, there's always a choice about which data source or which data source or collector produce, and often there's little sort of attention paid to involving actual involve people and communities in the data production, and so this is something that we want to stress and make sure this comes across. Now, another example really like, apart from Peta Jakarta, this one is also from Indonesia, is this one from a community drone project in Indonesia, where a group of activists were denied access to official government data in the village in West Kalimantan, which is a part of Borneo in Indonesia. And so they built their own drones to collect mapping data, and they then used this data to expose mining companies that were causing an environmental damage and who were violating land rights of indigenous communities. And so they took that data and was actually used in a case in front of the Constitutional Court and also by local parliamentarians, who then backed these villages, and the mining companies were actually held accountable for infringing land rights of indigenous communities. So this is a perfect example of people actually taking matters in their own hand, producing their own data and actually using it and being successful in their initiative. Now, last but not least, I mentioned it earlier, once you have to actually collect the data, think about if and to what extent you can make the data accessible to others. And obviously, sometimes this might not be possible because of privacy concerns, or because this, secret data or confidential data or data that shouldn't be shared. But often, actually, you can make it accessible or publicly accessible. And so, ideally, this should be integrated in your design when you actually design the data project. There's another option. If you cannot make it publicly accessible, you can at least share it back with those you've collected the data from or with. And there's a nice example here from Tanzania, which is called DataSitu, and they actually have organized shareback sessions where they sort of took the data they've collected from citizens and from villages. They ran workshops and trainings. They provided the data, they supported data analysis, data visualization, and helped these villages actually understand what the data stands for and what the data actually says, for them to be able to take action on that, which is quite similar to the Poverty Stoplight project we mentioned earlier. Okay, I'll stop here and I'll hand it back to Miko. Thanks so much.
But just to say very quickly that running a data empowerment check is an important process to see where you stand. Is your project actually here, where you're actually giving your participants in the project, your intended beneficiaries, or the communities that you're serving, actually as part of the process of defining their directions and making use of their data? Or are they just actually, is the data project actually here, wherein you actually just treat people and their data, or people apparently as spectators in the process of implementing your data for development project?